everyone, in this video we're going to be focusing on the cell. Now, all living organisms require cells to function, and cells are basically the building block of living organisms. You can be an organism that has just one cell, or you can be an organism that has multiple cells. But no matter what type of organism you have, your basic unit is the cell. Now, we're going to be really focusing on the two key groups of cells, so animal cells and plant cells, and we're going to be looking at a generalized view of the cells, because you have to realize that if we're looking at complex organisms like animals and plants, they have lots of different organs, they have lots of different organ systems, and all of these things require specialized cells. So we're going to be looking at the key components that a general cell would have. So let's get started. Before we can talk about the two types of cells, animals and plant cells, we really need to talk about what are the fundamental characteristics that makes something a living organism. And there's basically 5. First and foremost, a living organism needs to be composed of at least one cell. Now, we know that there are living organisms that are made of multiple cells, and we know that there are living organisms that are made of one cell. And we actually have a key we can split all of our living organisms into two key groups: multicellular organisms that have multiple cells and unicellular organisms that only have one cell. Now, for multicellular organisms, it is more than just 2. We're looking at like hundreds to thousands to potentially millions of cells, but by definition, multi just means 2 or more. Now, key organisms that are multicellular, we have animals, we have plants, and we have certain fungi. Organisms that are unicellular, we have primarily bacteria, and again also some fungi. So fungi that are unicellular would be things like yeast. Fungi that would be multicellular would be things like mushrooms. Our second characteristic to be considered living is that you need energy to function. Now, again, there are certain organisms that produce their own energy. There are certain organisms that eat other organisms for energy. But the key thing is that you need energy. The third is that you respond to your environment. Now, responding to your environment is quite broad, and we can split it up into like 2 distinctions in the sense that we're exchanging materials. So things like anything that is in the animal kingdom. So humans are part of the animal kingdom. We consume oxygen, because it's one of the necessary gases that we need to survive, and we exhale carbon dioxide because it's our waste product. We consume food as our source of energy, and we release waste products. So we're exchanging materials from outside of the body, inside of the body. And another thing is that responding to stimuli or reacting to stimuli. So this is also very broad. Key stimuli could be temperature, when it's hot, when it's cold, could be in the presence of danger. If there's something that is threatening you, running away. So we are reacting to our environment based on what's happening. The fourth characteristic of life is growing and repairing. So growing we can see very easily when you see, if you look at baby pictures, how big you were when you were a baby and how big you are now is drastically different because through that time you grew. And repairing, if you get a cut, it heals. If you break a bone, it heals. And we also have to realize that repair, there is a certain limit that your body can repair. If there is too much damage, the body cannot repair itself, but living organisms will grow and repair naturally. And the last characteristic of a living organism is the ability to reproduce, because the key thing for a living organism is that it wants to pass down its genetic information to its offspring. So an organism needs to be able to reproduce. And there's 2 key ways that an organism can reproduce. It can reproduce asexually or sexually. So asexual reproduction is kind of like cloning itself, and that is usually done by single-celled organisms, And what happens is that the cell basically copies all of its genetic information, copies itself, and splits into two parts. So you only really need one organism to undergo asexual reproduction. Now, sexual reproduction is a bit more complex, and in sexual reproduction, you would have two organisms. So you would have the male and the female version of the organism that would come together to produce an offspring. And the offspring has genetic information from both the male and the female individual. So sexual reproduction actually produces a lot of genetic diversity. So now that we've gone through the characteristics of life, what we are going to be focusing on is our first characteristic, which is the cell. Our first thing that we're going to do is we're going to be looking at animal cells. And animal cells are cells that we would find in organisms that are found in the animal kingdom. And remember, humans are part of the animal kingdom. So these are all basic cells that we would find if we were to do a cheek swab and we were to look at epithelial cells, and we would see a lot of these components. Now, before we talk about the different components of the animal cell, there's this concept of an organelle. And an organelle is a small part in the cell that has a specialized task. So if we're looking at our animal cell here, we see a lot of different structures, and each of these structures are considered organelles. So the first organelle that we're going to be talking about is the cell membrane. Now the cell membrane, it surrounds the entire cell. So if we're just going to highlight, the cell membrane would be everything that I've just highlighted in yellow. And its key functions is twofold. Once, it surrounds the cell and it controls what enters and exits the cell. So a good analogy of the cell membrane would be like a doorway, right? And items that can go into the cell go through the doorway. Items that don't go into the cell are blocked by the door. The second organelle that we're going to be talking about is the cytoplasm. Now, the cytoplasm is a gel-like structure that holds all of the organelles into place. So our cytoplasm, in our picture right here, it looks like it's the seemingly empty space, but it's not. So our cytoplasm would be everything that is holding our structure. So this would be our cytoplasm. And a good analogy to think about our cytoplasm would be like Jell-O. It has that gel-like structure. Most of it is composed of water and other components, and it holds all of the organelles into place, because without the cytoplasm, the organelles wouldn't have any particular place to adhere to in the cell. And another thing about the cytoplasm is that it allows for all of the reactions that happen in the cell to take place. So if we were to color in our cytoplasm in blue, it would be all of our seemingly empty space. But it's not empty, it's our gel-like structure that holds everything together. Okay, so we're going to move on to our next set of organelles that we find in our animal cell. So probably one of the most important organelles that we have is our nucleus. So our nucleus, I am going to be highlighting in yellow, is this structure right here. So what is being highlighted in yellow is our nucleus. And our nucleus is like the brain of the cell. It contains the DNA, which is the genetic information that tells the cell what it is, tells the cell all of its functions that it can do, tells the cell all of the different proteins it can make. So it basically gives the identity to the cell. Now, around the nucleus is something that's called a nuclear membrane, and it has the same function like the cell membrane. How the cell membrane basically controls what can enter and exit the cell, the nuclear membrane controls what can enter and exit the nucleus. And it's really important because the nucleus has all of your genetic information. So it has a lot of information that you don't want to get damaged. So the nuclear membrane is really selective of what can go into the nucleus and what doesn't go into the nucleus. So our nuclear membrane is going to be highlighted in green, and it's just the border around the nucleus. So this would be what our nuclear membrane is. It's the part that's in green that is around the nucleus. That is our nuclear membrane. The next thing that we're going to be looking at is vacuoles. Now, the animal cell has a lot of vacuoles that are actually specified for what they hold, but the key thing about a vacuole is it's kind of like the closet of the cell. It basically stores a whole bunch of materials for the cell. So here I'm going to be highlighting them in purple are our different vacuoles that we have in our animal cell. And the key function of the vacuole is to store necessary material that the cell needs. Now, each vacuole, depending on what it stores, has a specialized name, but we're not going to go into that much detail. The key thing that we just need to remember is that the animal cell has multiple smaller vacuoles that holds different materials. Okay, so the next three things that we're going to be looking at are the last three things that we find in an animal cell. And the first is a structure that is called the endoplasmic reticulum. Now, this is the structure that is responsible for producing proteins. Now, your cell requires proteins to function, and proteins do a lot of things in your body. They can be used to build different tissue, can be used for chemical reactions, and so on and so forth. So the endoplasmic reticulum is like the warehouse of your cell that produces all of these different proteins. So the endoplasmic reticulum, I am going to highlight in red, are these structures right here. They're near the nucleus because the information of how to build these proteins are actually found in the nucleus. So it makes sense that the endoplasmic reticulum is near the source of the information. You want your warehouse near the instruction manual, and the instruction manuals of how to build the proteins are saved in the nucleus. Now, the cell produces a whole bunch of these proteins, but a lot of the time the proteins don't stay in the cell. So there needs to be like an Amazon type place where these proteins can be shipped from one cell to another cell. And that's the responsibility of the Golgi apparatus. So I'm going to be highlighting it in blue, and the Golgi apparatus is this structure right here. And it's really responsible for packing the proteins that have been made and getting them ready to be shipped off to different parts of the body. Now, the last organelle in the animal structure, but not least, is probably one of the most important parts of the animal cell, and that is the mitochondria, which is being highlighted in yellow. And this is like the energy power plant of the cell. It's where the food that the animal ingests, glucose, goes into and is burned to produce energy. So the mitochondria is super, super important. This is where the necessary energy for the cell to function is produced. So the mitochondria, again, the power plant of the cell, where food, in this case glucose, is burned to produce energy. So these are the key organelles that you find in the animal cell and their key functions. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to be looking at the organelles that we find in the plant cell. Now, a lot of the organelles that you have in the animal cell are found in the plant cells. There's only about 3 key differences, which we're going to be going through. So if we're looking at our plant cell, there is a lot of organelles that are the same. So first and foremost, our cell membrane. So our cell membrane is the inner layer of our plant cell. The cytoplasm, again, is our jelly-like structure that fills up all of the seemingly empty space, but again, not empty space. It is the structure to allow all of the other organelles to be in a spot. The nucleus and the nuclear envelope, which is right here, our mitochondria, which is right here, our endoplasmic reticulum, which is right here. Again, our mitochondria, our power plant of the cell. It basically takes glucose and burns it into energy. Our endoplasmic reticulum, right next to our nucleus, because our endoplasmic reticulum is responsible for making proteins, and the information of how to make the proteins are kept in the nucleus. So the endoplasmic reticulum is very close to that source of information. And our Golgi apparatus, which again is like our Amazon of the cell, because it takes the produced proteins and it basically transports it through the different parts of the body. So all of these are the same. In our plant cells, we have 3 key differences. Number 1, there is a cell wall. And that's basically the outer layer of our cell, because we need to realize animals, we have an internal structure to give us shape. We have bones, and animals that don't have bones have specialized cells, exoskeletons, to give you that shape. Plants don't, so they need to have a solid structure to be able to give that shape, which is the cell wall. Second is plants produce their own food. So there needs to actually be an organelle to be able to produce that glucose, which is our chloroplast. And then the third key difference is that plant cells have one giant vacuole. They don't actually have the tiny vacuoles that are found in our animal cells. They have one giant vacuole where all of the material is stored. So cell waste, cell nutrients, cell products are all found in that one general vacuole. So the first thing that we're going to talk about is our central vacuole. So our central vacuole is this big, big structure right here. And it's, again, just has the same function as the vacuole in our plant cells. It's just really, really big, and there's only one to store everything. Our second key difference is that our plant cells have a cell wall. Now our cell wall is the outer layer surrounding the cell, which is being highlighted in blue. And its key function is to protect the cell and provide the cell structure. And the key ingredient that is actually found in the production of the cell wall is a molecule called cellulose. Now, the last key difference in the plant cell, and probably the most important, is an organelle called chloroplast. Now, chloroplast is what's being highlighted in green. It's actually the component of a plant cell that allows the cell to produce its own food, because that one key characteristic of plants is they're the group of organisms that produce their own food. And they do this through a process called photosynthesis. So what the plant cell does is that it takes energy from the sun, it takes carbon dioxide and water, and those 3 things in a chemical reaction produces glucose and oxygen. And this reaction happens inside the chloroplast of plant cells. So the chloroplast is this structure right here. And the pigment inside of the chloroplast, chlorophyll, is green. And that's actually what gives plants, particularly leaves, their green color, is because of the chloroplast structures. To recap, our 3 key major differences between animal and plant cells. The first is that plants contain a cell wall, and this cell wall gives protection and structure to plant cells because plants do not have bones. They need some sort of way to have a strong structure, and this is done by the cell wall. Second, plants contain chloroplast, and this is the organelle where photosynthesis takes place. And it's really, really important because plants need to have a way to make energy, and they make energy through photosynthesis. And the organelle that is responsible for this is chloroplast. And then the last key difference between the animal and plant cell is that in the plant cell, there's only one big vacuole that stores everything. In animal cells, there are multiple smaller vacuoles, and each one is specialized for what they're storing. So this is basically the recap of the key differences between animal and plant cells and the structures that are found in each. I hope this is helpful, and have a great day.